You know how sometimes you find an old coin in your grandma's attic, or maybe a super ancient rock on a hike, and you just wonder, what stories could this tell? Well, imagine finding something way, way older than that. Something that's not just a coin or a rock, but a piece of a creature that lived millions of years ago, long before even the dinosaurs were a distant memory. And then, imagine that tiny piece, maybe just a tooth or a bit of a jawbone, sparking a huge argument among scientists about how we, humans, actually got here. Sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie, right? But it's totally real. This is the story of something called Ouranopithecus, and trust me, its name is almost as cool as the mysteries it holds. It all starts in a time that's almost impossible to picture. We're talking about the Miocene epoch. Not millions of years ago, but way more than that. Imagine turning the clock back, not just to when your great-grandparents were kids or even when the pyramids were being built, but to a time so far back that the continents themselves looked different. Europe wasn't quite the Europe we know today. It was a warm, lush place covered in thick forests. Think of jungles, but in places you'd now find vineyards and ancient ruins. It was a world bursting with life, some familiar, some totally alien. Giant sloths the size of cars, strange deer with tusks, and even early elephants roamed freely. It was a wild, untamed paradise, or at least that's how I imagine it. And in this ancient European jungle, there lived an ape. Not quite a monkey, not quite a human, but something in between. Or perhaps something that was on a path to becoming one or the other. This ape, this Ouranopithecus, is the main character in our mystery. Its name, Ouranopithecus, comes from Ouranos, which is Greek for sky or heaven, and Pithecus, which means ape. So, heavenly ape, or sky ape. Sounds pretty grand for a creature that lived so long ago and was only found as tiny fossil bits, doesn't it? But its grand name hints at the grand questions it raises. The discovery itself is pretty cool, like a detective story spanning decades. The first real clues to Ouranopithecus started showing up in the late 1970s. Imagine a team of paleontologists, those awesome scientists who dig up old bones, working in a place called Ravin de la Pluie in northern Greece. Sounds like Rainy Gully, doesn't it? It's a dry, dusty place now, a far cry from the lush forests it once was. But under all that dust and rock, something incredible was waiting. One day they found it, a fossilized piece of a jawbone. Not a full skull, not a complete skeleton, just a fragment. But even that small piece was enough to make them stop and stare. This wasn't just any old ape jaw. It had features that seemed different. A bit more robust, maybe a bit more like something they had only seen in later fossils, the ones they knew were closer to us. Now you might think, okay, a jawbone. What's the big deal? But for paleontologists, a jawbone, especially one with teeth still in it, is like finding a treasure map to the past. Teeth, especially, are super important. They're hard, they preserve well, and their shape tells you a lot about what an animal ate, how it chewed, and even hints about its overall head shape and how strong its jaws were. The teeth on this Ouranopithecus jaw were large and covered in thick enamel, that hard outer layer. Think of your own teeth, how tough they are. These were even tougher, suggesting that Ouranopithecus might have been munching on some pretty hard stuff, like nuts or tough seeds or maybe even roots. This was a clue about its diet, and diet often tells you about habitat. But it wasn't just the teeth themselves. It was the arrangement of the teeth, the shape of the jawbone, the way the muscles would have attached. These tiny details, almost invisible to the untrained eye, were like secret codes to the scientists. They started comparing this Greek jawbone to other ape fossils found around the world, especially those from Africa. Why Africa? Because Africa is where most scientists think the very first humans, our earliest ancestors, came from. So if you Find something that looks a bit like those African ancestors, but it's found in Europe, suddenly things get really interesting. And that's exactly what happened with Ouranopithecus. When they looked at this jaw, they saw features that reminded them of something called Dryopithecus, another ancient ape found in Europe. But it also had hints, tiny whispers, of features seen in much later hominins. That's the fancy science. Word for humans and all our direct ancestors and close relatives. It was like finding a puzzle piece that seemed to fit two different puzzles, and nobody was quite sure which one it truly belonged to. Was it just another extinct ape, a distant cousin that branched off and then died out? Or was it something more? Could it be a long-lost grandparent of humanity, a very early step on our evolutionary staircase? This question, this massive what if, is what made Ouranopithecus famous in the world of paleoanthropology. Imagine being a scientist and realizing that a tiny bone fragment could rewrite entire chapters of human history. It was mind-blowing. Up until that point, the prevailing idea, the one taught in most textbooks, was pretty straightforward. Human evolution was an exclusively African story. All the important steps, from the first apes to walk upright to the emergence of modern humans, happened on the African continent. This was called the out of Africa hypothesis, and it made a lot of sense, especially with all the amazing fossil discoveries happening in places like the Great Rift Valley in East Africa. But then came Ouranopithecus from Greece, waving its little jawbone and saying, "Hey, wait a minute, what about me?" Its discovery challenged that tidy out-of-Africa narrative. If Ouranopithecus truly had features that linked it to later African hominins, what did that mean? Did some early human ancestors actually evolve in Europe and then migrate back to Africa? Or did a very early ape ancestor live in both places, and the human lineage just happened to evolve in Africa from one of those branches? It opened up a whole new can of worms, or rather, a whole new branch of the family tree. The scientists, of course, didn't just find one jawbone and call it a day. Over the years, more fossils of Ouranopithecus have been found in the same area of Greece. They found more teeth, parts of a face, and even some bits of the skull. Each new discovery was like adding another piece to that incredibly old, incredibly important puzzle. And with each new piece, the picture of Ouranopithecus became a little clearer. We learned more about its face. It likely had a broad face, large brow ridges, like a thick bony shelf over its eyes, and a pretty big snout, compared to us. Not exactly a Hollywood movie star, but a very important figure in our distant past. They also started to figure out its size. Based on the jaw and skull fragments, they estimated Ouranopithecus was a fairly large ape, maybe around the size of a modern chimpanzee, or even a bit bigger, perhaps like a gorilla. Imagine an ape this big, with powerful jaws and grinding teeth, living in the ancient forests of Greece. It would have been a formidable creature, a true king of its jungle domain. And yet, this powerful ape holds clues to something much smaller and more vulnerable, the beginnings of humanity. The scientific debates around Ouranopithecus weren't just about where humans came from. They were also about how different ape species were related to each other. Think of it like a giant family tree with hundreds of branches and twigs, and scientists trying to figure out which twig connects to which branch and which big branch leads to us. Ouranopithecus became one of those tricky twigs that seemed to connect in a surprising way. Some scientists argued that its dental features, particularly the thickness of its tooth enamel and the shape of its molars, were so similar to early hominins like Australopithecus, which lived in Africa much later, that it just had to be closely related, maybe even a direct ancestor. They pointed to the way its jaw was structured, suggesting a powerful chewing apparatus, similar to what you might expect in an early human ancestor that ate tough, fibrous plants. But other scientists looked at the same fossils and said, "Hold on a minute. Those similarities could just be a coincidence. Maybe Ouranopithecus evolved those features on its own. Because it ate similar food, not because it's directly related to us. This is called convergent evolution, where different species evolve similar traits because they face similar environmental challenges. Think of how bats and birds both developed wings for flight, but they're not closely related. The same idea could apply to Ouranopithecus and early hominins. Maybe they just happened to evolve similar teeth for similar diets, but their family lines were actually quite separate. This kind of scientific detective work isn't easy. It's not like you just find a fossil, scan it, and a computer tells you exactly who it's related to. It involves careful comparison, measuring tiny angles, analyzing microscopic features, and a lot of educated guesswork based on the best available evidence. And even then, scientists can disagree. That's actually a good thing, though. It means they're constantly pushing each other to find more evidence, to rethink their ideas, and to get closer to the truth. So, Ouranopithecus became a symbol of this big debate. Was it just a cool, ancient ape that happened to live in Europe and die out? Or was it a crucial piece of the human puzzle suggesting that our origins might not be as simple and geographically confined as we once thought? The implications were huge. So, we left off with Ouranopithecus, this ancient ape from Greece, shaking up everything scientists thought they knew about human origins. It was like finding out your favorite superhero actually had a secret origin story in a totally different city. For decades, the out-of-Africa idea was strong. It made sense. All the really old, definitely human-like fossils, like Lucy and her crew, Australopithecus afarensis, were found in Africa. So, it felt like a neat, tidy package. But Ouranopithecus messed with that neatness in the best possible way, forcing everyone to look closer and ask tougher questions. Imagine a paleontologist, let's call her Dr. Anya Sharma, poring over a tiny, fossilized tooth. To us, it might look like a brown, bumpy pebble. To her, it's a blueprint. She's not just looking at its size, but the little ridges and valleys on its chewing surface, the thickness of the enamel, the way it's worn down. Every scratch, every curve, tells a story about what that ancient creature ate and how it chewed. And these details, these superfine points of dental anatomy, are what caused so much of the debate around Ouranopithecus. Remember I mentioned Australopithecus? That's a really important group of early hominins, the ones who were definitely walking upright, or at least mostly upright, and are considered direct ancestors of humans. They lived in Africa a few million years after Ouranopithecus. Now, here's the kicker. Some scientists argued that the teeth of Ouranopithecus shared some really specific features with Australopithecus. We're talking about thick enamel, certain cusp patterns, the bumps on your molars, and even the size of the molars relative to the other teeth. These weren't just general similarities. They were very particular, almost like a family resemblance. If these dental similarities were more than just a coincidence, if they were shared, derived traits, as scientists call them, meaning unique features inherited from a common ancestor, then it would strongly suggest that Ouranopithecus and Australopithecus had a common ancestor that lived even earlier. And if that common ancestor lived in Europe, or if Ouranopithecus itself was that direct ancestor, and then some of its descendants moved to Africa, well, that would be a game changer. It would mean that a crucial part of our family tree branched off in Europe, not just Africa, but not everyone was convinced. Another group of scientists, let's call them the African firsters, had a strong point too. They argued that those dental similarities could be a result of convergent evolution. Imagine you have two separate groups of people living on different continents, but both relying on hard, tough foods like nuts or roots. Over many generations, both groups might develop stronger jaws and thicker enameled teeth, simply because those traits help them survive and pass on their genes. It doesn't mean they're closely related. It just means they faced similar challenges. This is a common thing in evolution. Think of sharks and dolphins. They both have streamlined bodies and fins because they live in water, but one is a fish and the other is a mammal, super far apart on the family tree. So for Ouranopithecus, the argument went like this. Maybe The Greek ape and the early African hominins just happened to evolve thick enamel and strong jaws because they both adapted to similar diets in drying, changing environments. The Miocene epoch, during which Ouranopithecus lived, wasn't static. There were big changes happening to the climate and landscapes. Forests were starting to shrink in some areas, and open woodlands and grasslands were expanding. Animals living in these changing environments would have had to adapt, perhaps by eating tougher, more abrasive foods that were available when softer fruits were scarce. This environmental pressure could have driven the evolution of similar dental features in different ape lineages, whether they were closely related or not. The debate wasn't just about teeth, though. It was also about the face. Ouranopithecus had a broad face, and some scientists saw this as another link to later hominins, particularly those Australopithecus species that also had broad, flatter faces compared to earlier apes. But again, the African firsters could argue that facial breadth could also be an adaptation to powerful chewing muscles, another example of convergent evolution. It's like a really complicated game of spot the difference, where the differences are tiny and the stakes are huge. To try and settle these debates, scientists needed more than just teeth and jawbones. They needed more parts of the skeleton, especially parts that could tell them about how Ouranopithecus moved around. Did it swing through trees like a modern orangutan? Did it walk on all fours like a chimpanzee? Or was it starting to do something different? Something like walking upright, even for short distances, like our earliest ancestors. Unfortunately, when it comes to Ouranopithecus, we don't have much beyond the head. No arm bones, no leg bones, no hip bones, just bits and pieces of the skull and jaw. This makes it super hard to know for sure how it moved, and movement is a huge clue in understanding human evolution. Bipedalism, walking on two legs, is one of the defining characteristics that separates hominins from other apes. Without limb bones, it's a big mystery. Still, the limited fossil evidence from the skull did offer some hints, even if they weren't direct. The way the muscles would have attached to the jaw and skull suggests a powerful chewing apparatus, yes, but also a somewhat forward-projecting face, not as flat as a modern human's, but possibly less prognathic, less snout-like than some other apes of its time. These subtle features kept the spark of possibility alive. Maybe Ouranopithecus really was on a branch close to our own. The geographical location also played a big role in the mystery. Why Greece? If the human lineage really started in Europe, how did it end up in Africa, where all the later, more definitive hominin fossils are found? One idea is that there was a back migration. Imagine a group of early ape-like ancestors living in Europe. As the climate changed and environments shifted, some of them might have migrated south, through what is now the Middle East, and eventually into Africa. If they then continued to evolve in Africa, that could explain why we find all the later hominin fossils there. It's a bit of a stretch, and there's not much direct fossil evidence for such a migration route from Europe to Africa for a creature like Ouranopithecus. But it's a possibility that had to be considered because the fossils were there, staring them in the face. Another scenario is that Ouranopithecus was part of a wider group of apes that lived across both Europe and Africa during the Miocene. Back then, the land connections between the continents were different, and there might have been periods where animals could move relatively freely between them. So it's possible that a common ancestor of both Ouranopithecus and the African hominins lived somewhere in between, or that separate populations of a widely distributed ape evolved in parallel. It makes the family tree look less like a single straight line and more like a complicated tangled bush, with branches going every which way and some even intertwining. The scientific community is still grappling with these ideas. While Ouranopithecus definitely made everyone reconsider the out-of-Africa theory, most evidence still points to Africa as the primary cradle of human evolution. However, the discovery of Ouranopithecus showed that the story is much more complex than a simple straight line. It highlighted the possibility that Europe might have been a crucible for some very early, important ape evolution, and that some of those European apes might have even shared common ancestors with the African apes that eventually led to humans. What does this mean for us, kids trying to understand our super ancient past? It means that science is always changing, always improving. What's in a textbook today might be updated tomorrow with a new fossil discovery or a new way of looking at old evidence. It's like a never-ending detective story, and every new clue, no matter how small, can change the whole plot. Ouranopithecus, even without a complete skeleton, became a superstar in this story, a tiny jawbone that dared to challenge a big, established idea. The story of Ouranopithecus also reminds us how fragile the fossil record is. We're talking about creatures that lived millions of years ago, most of them just decomposed and disappeared without a trace. It's only by some incredible luck that a tiny fraction of them get buried in just the right conditions to turn into rock over eons. So every fossil is precious, and even a single tooth can hold immense scientific value. It's like finding one page of a really old, really important book. You might not have the whole story, but that one page can still tell you so much and open up new avenues of thought. And the search continues. Paleontologists are still digging. In Greece, in Africa, and all over the world, looking for more pieces of this incredible puzzle. Maybe one day they'll find a more complete skeleton of Ouranopithecus, with arm bones and leg bones, and finally figure out how it moved. Maybe they'll find even older hominin fossils in Europe or Asia that solidify a European origin. Or maybe they'll find new evidence in Africa that reinforces the out-of-Africa hypothesis even more strongly. That's the exciting part of science. The answers aren't always easy, and sometimes the best questions are the ones that lead to even more questions. Ouranopithecus taught us that our family tree is likely far more tangled and interesting than we ever imagined. So, we've talked about Ouranopithecus as this super old ape that lived in Greece millions of years ago, and how its tiny jawbone got scientists arguing big time about where humans really came from. It's like a huge family secret that a little old photograph suddenly brings to light. But to really get why Ouranopithecus is such a big deal, we need to zoom out a bit and understand the bigger picture of what was happening on Earth during the Miocene epoch, that super ancient time when it lived. Because the world Ouranopithecus lived in was changing in ways that would eventually affect everything, including the very path of human evolution. Imagine the Earth like a giant slow-motion movie, constantly shifting and changing. During the Miocene, from about 23 to 5.3 million years ago, a lot of dramatic stuff was going on. One of the biggest changes was the climate. For a long time, Earth had been pretty warm and wet, and lush forests covered huge parts of the planet. Think tropical jungles stretching across continents that are now much drier. But during the Miocene, especially in the middle and later parts, things started to cool down and dry out. Not everywhere all at once, but enough to start causing big shifts in environments. This cooling and drying wasn't just about a little less rain. It meant that those vast, unbroken forests began to shrink. They didn't disappear completely, but they became patchier, broken up by more open woodlands and, eventually, vast stretches of grasslands. Imagine what that means for animals. If you're an ape that's used to swinging through trees, eating fruits and soft leaves, and suddenly your forest home starts to break up, what do? You have to adapt, right? You either find new food sources, or you learn new ways to move around, or you find a new place to live, or, well, you go extinct. This environmental pressure was like a giant evolutionary sorting hat, pushing different species in new directions. Now let's think about Ouranopithecus in this changing landscape. It lived in Europe, specifically in what is now Greece. And even in Europe, these environmental shifts were happening. The Mediterranean Sea, which we know today, was actually undergoing some pretty crazy changes too, with periods where it almost completely dried up. Imagine that. A whole sea turning into a salt desert. These extreme events would have had massive impacts on local climates and ecosystems. So the picture of Ouranopithecus living in a static, unchanging paradise is wrong. It was living in a dynamic, sometimes challenging world. The thick enamel on Ouranopithecus's teeth, which we talked about before, makes a lot more sense when you think about these drying environments. If soft fruits became scarcer, Ouranopithecus might have had to rely more on tougher, more abrasive foods. Things like hard-shelled nuts, seeds, roots, or even bark. Chewing these foods would wear down thin enamel really fast, but thick enamel would protect the teeth and allow the ape to get enough nutrients. So its dental features weren't just random, they were powerful adaptations to its changing world. It was surviving by becoming a tough eater. This brings us to a really important idea in evolution: adaptation. Organisms aren't just stuck the way they are. They slowly change over generations to better fit their environment. Ouranopithecus's teeth and jaw structure are prime examples of this. It wasn't just a bigger, stronger version of an earlier ape. It was evolving features that helped it thrive in a world that was becoming less predictable and more diverse in its food offerings. This capacity for adaptation is key to understanding why some lineages survived and others didn't. But the story of the Miocene isn't just about Europe, it's also, crucially, about Africa. Because while Europe was experiencing its own climatic shifts, similar patterns were unfolding in Africa. East Africa, in particular, was undergoing massive geological changes. The Great Rift Valley, that huge crack in the Earth's crust, was forming, pushing up mountains and creating a complex mosaic of environments. Everything from active volcanoes to deep lakes, and importantly, areas of dense forest next to spreading grasslands. It's in this dynamic African landscape that most scientists believe the story of human evolution truly began. It's where we find the fossils of those early hominins, like Sahelanthropus, Orarin, and of course, Australopithecus. These creatures, appearing millions of years after Ouranopithecus, are the ones with the more definitive signs of bipedalism, walking on two legs, and other features that clearly set them apart from other apes and put them on our direct lineage. So, how does Ouranopithecus fit into this global picture? The argument isn't just about its teeth. It's about how global environmental changes might have influenced the dispersal and evolution of apes across continents. One idea is that during the early and middle Miocene, when things were still pretty warm and wet, apes were widespread across Eurasia and Africa. They might have moved relatively freely between these land masses when sea levels were lower or land bridges existed. So, the common ancestor of Ouranopithecus and the African ape lineages, which would eventually include gorillas, chimpanzees, and humans, might have been a broadly distributed species. Then, as the climate changed and the environments dried, these widespread ape populations would have become more isolated. Imagine populations of the same ape species getting cut off from each other by deserts or mountains. Once isolated, they would start to evolve independently, adapting to their local conditions. This is called allopatric speciation, and it's a powerful driver of evolution. So the European Ouranopithecus evolved its way, and the African apes evolved theirs. The debate then comes down to, did the European Ouranopithecus evolve features that were so similar to later African hominins that it suggests a direct link? Or were those similarities just parallel evolution due to similar environmental pressures? Think about the time difference, too. Ouranopithecus lived around 9.6 to 8.7 million years ago. The earliest definitive hominins in Africa, like Sahelanthropus, appear around 7 to 6 million years ago, and Australopithecus much later, from about 4 to 2 million years ago. There's a big time gap. If Ouranopithecus was a direct ancestor, it means there's a missing piece of the puzzle, a gap of several million years where its descendants would have had to migrate to Africa and then continue evolving. Scientists call this the ghost lineage, a lineage that must have existed but for which we have no fossil evidence yet. The idea of a back migration from Europe to Africa is exciting because it challenges a long-held view, but it requires a lot of fossil evidence to support it. And right now, that evidence is pretty scarce. It would mean finding ape fossils in the Middle East or North Africa from that critical time period, between Ouranopithecus in Europe and the earliest hominins in East Africa, that show a clear transition. So far, those definitive fossils haven't been found. That doesn't mean they don't exist, just that they haven't been discovered yet. And finding fossils is incredibly hard. It's like finding a needle in a haystack the size of a continent, multiplied by millions of years. Despite the lack of direct evidence for a back migration, Ouranopithecus still forced scientists to broaden their thinking. It made them consider that perhaps the split between the hominin lineage, our line, and the chimpanzee-gorilla lineage didn't happen in one isolated spot in Africa. Maybe the common ancestor of all great apes, including us, chimps, gorillas, and orangutans, was more widespread, and the specific divergence that led to humans could have involved populations that were in Europe or Asia before moving back to Africa. It's a much more messy and complicated family tree, but potentially more accurate. The very fact that Ouranopithecus existed and had those particular features tells us something important about ape evolution during the Miocene. It shows that there was a lot of diversity among ancient apes. They weren't all just little versions of modern chimpanzees. They had different body sizes, different diets, and different ways of moving. Some were probably adapting to drier, more open environments, even if they weren't yet walking fully upright like later hominins. This diversity means that evolution was experimenting, trying out different solutions to environmental challenges, and Ouranopithecus represents one of those interesting experiments. So, while Ouranopithecus might not be our direct great-great-great-grandparent after all, it's still a crucial character in the story. It taught us that the road to humanity wasn't necessarily a simple, straight line from A to B. It was more like a winding path through a dense forest, with many forks, dead ends, and unexpected detours. And sometimes, a fossil from an unexpected place, like a dusty gully in Greece, can shine a light on those hidden paths and make us question everything we thought we knew. The mystery of Ouranopithecus is still being explored, and its legacy is a more open-minded approach to understanding our incredibly long and complex family history. The more we learn, the more we realize how many amazing stories are still hidden beneath the Earth's surface waiting to be discovered.